Pleasure to meet y'all at last, and welcome back to films I should have talked about years ago. Because now, let's get into some more territory in the 1980s with a film starring Tom Hanks, Shelley Long, Art Mantegna, and several others called The Money Pit. Yeah, this one's quite an underrated classic the way I see it. It's one of many Tom Hanks classics that I feel like should never be overlooked. With some of the older examples of Tom Hanks' film career, it does make sense that a lot of trial and error had to come by before eventually sparking popularity amongst many other audiences throughout the world. And throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and up until this point where Tom Hanks is still one of the most remembered American actors around by this point, it still is worth noting that The Money Pit is one of those parts in the ladder that Tom Hanks had to climb up in order to reach the top level of popularity and fame. But The Money Pit is more than just that little point in life. It was released in 1986, the same year as Ferris Bueller's Day Off, King Kong Lives, Aliens, and a variety of other films. So you can tell it was a pretty busy year by film for the most part. Otherwise, this film is basically about a couple who goes into an abandoned home and attempts a home renovation, an extreme home renovation. A lot of errors take place, and a lot of things occur that cause pretty big parts in the construction to take place. Eventually it gets to a point where a rift happens in their relationship, and they end up trying to go their separate ways, but eventually find out that an extreme house construction project is not going to separate them completely, no matter the cost. This film is certainly one of the many big examples of auras being generated into humorous gags and memorable scenes that have been parodied many times over. In American Dad, for example, one episode shows Stan and Francine arguing over how the house should be renovated. Either it can be made like a log cabin or it can be made like a modern day suite of some sorts. It goes down to the point where extreme separation and isolation take place from each other, but eventually they get back to each other very quickly, after realizing how big of a problem it is to try and redecorate a home that they both live in. The Money Pit, though, is certainly one of the first examples to house this exact sort of cliche, where a house project can in fact cause drama and other related anomalies that happen between the different characters. Character development in this is crucial, because without it, then we really wouldn't have had such a memorable part of this exact film. I will say though, being that I saw this on Netflix not too long ago, it does make sense that I myself am more than willing to talk about this being an underrated classic, because even though this only grossed at $55 million in the box office, and it does not necessarily have all the big talents that it probably should have, a lot of the creative development that came place, including the fact that Amblin Entertainment themselves was already well recognized for basically supervising the project behind the production of E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Yeah. To this day, that still does remain Amblin's logo for the record, but in terms of The Money Pit, only 4 years later, you could certainly see how that shows. How progress does in fact happen to have a few obstacles, but Amblin Entertainment does know when to come out of them at some given point in time, given to the fact that this one was not necessarily met with glowing reviews and lots of other sorts of well-known popularity and fame. But this film still does have more than enough to make up for these sort of losses that come into play. For Tom Hanks and many other well-known actors, including some that would eventually be more well-known within the next few decades, The Money Pit is not necessarily met with all the best sorts of glamour or all the best known positive reaction, but it still does have a lot of cherishing moments in it. It's more humble in a way, much like Son of Kong. But this still does not necessarily have everything. It does need to be very well met and well successful. Yet there are still a lot of moments that I myself still recall. I especially like the moment where Tom Hanks falls into a hole wrapped up tightly in a rug and ends up getting stuck there for quite a while. And I tell you, that was pretty impressive. The fact that Tom Hanks' feet were dangling from the ceiling and nobody even seems to notice whenever they walk by, I mean, that right there is just hilarious. Tom Hanks getting stuck in the hole to the point where, well, not much can ever be done. Complete and total immobilization had taken over and, well, kind of threatened the poor guy's life right there. Otherwise, The Money Pit is certainly an underrated classic, and I won't necessarily go ahead and go as far to call it a masterpiece because, well, first of all, it's not. $55 million in the box office doesn't really account for a whole lot. But at least it does show that Tom Hanks' film career was not over yet. It was far from over, with many other films in the 1980s that would follow along in Hanks' career, like Big, Turner and Hooch, and then into the 1990s with films like Forrest Gump, Toy Story, That Thing You Do, Sleepless in Seattle, and so on and so on. All these other films would go to show that Hanks' career is far from over, and it would even become way better within the next few decades, up until this point, where Hanks still has an incredible net worth that is enough to rival many other well-known, highly acclaimed A-tier actors. Still, nonetheless, if I were to give this film a score, then, well, it's still going to be a bit low. Lower than expected, even though I happen to like this film a lot more than many others. So 6.5 out of 10. That's basically all I can put together for this. 6.5 suits it just right. And I will go as far to call this one an underrated classic, but when it comes to other films out there that came around during the same exact era in history, there are many other examples. And don't worry, tomorrow there comes yet another classic. But if you want to see more go down on my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.